Jackson Rivers froze mid-stride, his weathered hand gripping the auction house door frame as the auctioneer's hammer cracked against wood. The girl standing beside the livestock pen wasn't cattle. She was human, barely 20, with hollow eyes that had seen too much darkness for someone so young. The drunk man wasn't selling a horse. He was selling his daughter. A woman in the crowd gasped and stumbled backward, her parasol clattering to the dusty ground. Children pressed their faces against their mothers' skirts, sensing something fundamentally wrong in the Montana air. The girl's bare feet were caked with dried blood, her wrists rope-burned raw. Jack's chest tightened as he remembered his own sister's face 15 years ago. The same haunted stare, the same defeated slump of shoulders. She'd disappeared one winter night and never came home. Now here stood another broken soul, about to vanish forever into God knows what hell. "Going once for $40, the auctioneer bellowed. Who was she, and how much time did she have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The bidding war erupted like wildfire through dry grass. Jack's throat constricted as he watched respectable townsmen wave their hands, treating the girl like prize livestock at the county fair. $45. $50. The numbers climbed while she stood motionless, her dark hair matted against her face, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. $60 from the gentleman in the black hat. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the packed dirt arena. Jack's stomach churned as he recognized the bidder, Samuel Hutchins, who ran the brothel on the edge of town. Every decent person in Bitterroot Valley knew what happened to girls who disappeared into that hellhole. The drunk man beside the pen swayed dangerously, clutching his whiskey bottle like a lifeline. "She's strong as an ox," he slurred to anyone listening. "Don't eat much neither. Perfect for whatever work you got in mind." His laughter was hollow, desperate. Jack noticed the way the man's hands shook, how his eyes never quite met the girl's face. Guilt, shame, the terrible arithmetic of survival that drove fathers to unspeakable choices. Jack's weathered fingers found the leather pouch in his vest pocket. $37 and change, his entire life savings, meant for buying a decent horse and starting fresh somewhere new. The smart play was to walk away, find work elsewhere, pretend he'd never seen those empty eyes that mirrored his lost sister's last desperate plea for help. $75? Hutchins called out, his gold teeth gleaming in the afternoon sun. The crowd murmured approval. The girl flinched as if struck, and for just a moment her gaze found Jack's across the dusty arena. In that instant, he saw something that stopped his heart cold: recognition, not of him, but of her fate. She knew exactly what $75 would buy her. The drunk man's face crumpled. "She ain't even mine," he whispered, so quietly only Jack could hear. "Found her half dead by the creek 3 years back. Been good to me, though. Cooks, cleans, never complains." His voice broke. "But winter's coming, and I ain't got nothing left to trade but her." Jack's hand tightened around his meager savings. $37 wouldn't save her from Hutchins, wouldn't even come close. But maybe it could buy him time to figure out another way. The auctioneer raised his gavel, preparing to seal the girl's doom with 3 decisive strikes. "Going once at $75. Jack stepped forward, his boots grinding against the packed earth. Every eye in the crowd turned toward him. The quiet Cherokee-Irish cowboy who drifted into town 3 weeks ago looking for honest work. He opened his mouth, knowing these next words would change everything, would drain his last hope of starting over somewhere clean and new. $100, he called out, his voice cutting through the sudden silence like a blade through silk. The girl's head snapped up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. The auction house fell silent as a tomb, $100, more money than most folks in Bitterroot Valley saw in 6 months. Jack felt every pair of eyes boring into him, measuring his worn clothes against his impossible bid. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized what he'd just done. He didn't have $100. Hell, he barely had enough for a decent meal and a night's lodging. But the girl was staring at him now, those hollow eyes suddenly blazing with something he couldn't quite name. Hope? Terror? Recognition? Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but had forgotten how words worked. $100. The auctioneer's voice cracked with excitement. Do I hear 110? Samuel Hutchins turned in his seat, his predatory gaze fixed on Jack like a hawk studying a field mouse. The brothel keeper's scarred face split into a cold smile. You got that kind of money, Breed? The slur hit like a slap, designed to remind everyone present that Jack's Cherokee blood made him less than human in polite society. Jack's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. I've got it. Prove it! Hutchins rose from his seat, all 6 feet of muscle and malice. The crowd shifted nervously. Everyone knew Hutchins' reputation. The way men who crossed him had a habit of disappearing into the wilderness, their bones picked clean by coyotes. The drunk man who'd brought the girl stumbled forward, desperation etched into every line of his weathered face. Please, mister, he whispered to Jack. She ain't got nowhere else to go. Been like a daughter to me, but I can't. His voice broke. Winter's coming and the bank's going to take my land. She'll starve if she stays with me. Jack studied the man's face, searching for deception. But all he saw was the hollow desperation of someone who'd run out of choices. The kind of desperation that made decent people do terrible things. What's her name? Sarah. The man's eyes filled with tears. Sarah Whitehawk. Found her by Willow Creek 3 years back, half dead from fever and frostbite. Never said much about where she came from. Figured someone hurt her real bad. Sarah Whitehawk. The name hit Jack like lightning. He'd heard it whispered in trading posts and saloons from here to the Canadian border. The lost granddaughter of old Iron Bear Whitehawk, the Lakota chief who'd built a cattle empire that stretched across 3 territories. The girl everyone assumed was dead, killed in the same raid that wiped out her family 15 years ago. Jack's blood ran cold as pieces of a horrific puzzle began clicking into place. The timing was right. The age was right. And those eyes, he'd seen eyes like that before, in the mirror every morning since he was 12 years old and watched his own family burn. 125, Hutchins called out, his voice dripping with contempt. Let's see what kind of man you really are, Breed. The crowd murmured eagerly. This wasn't just an auction anymore. It was a pissing contest between 2 men who represented everything wrong with the Montana Territory. The civilized businessman who sold human misery behind closed doors, and the half-breed drifter who had the audacity to challenge him. Jack's mind raced. He had $37 to his name. Even if he sold his horse, his guns, his boots, everything he owned, he might scrape together $60, 70 at most. But Sarah was watching him with those burning eyes, and he saw something in her face that made his chest tighten with recognition. She wasn't just afraid. She was calculating, planning. The same look he'd seen in his sister's eyes the night she disappeared, the look of someone preparing to run, no matter the cost. Going once at 125, the auctioneer bellowed. Jack stepped forward close enough to smell the whiskey on the drunk man's breath. You said you found her by Willow Creek? That's right. During the February thaw 3 years back. The man's voice was barely a whisper. She was wearing this. He pulled a tarnished silver locket from his pocket, its surface etched with intricate beadwork patterns. Tried to get her to tell me where it came from, but she just cries whenever I ask. Jack's world tilted sideways. He knew that locket. had seen it around his grandmother's neck during the few precious years before the soldiers came. Traditional Lakota silverwork, passed down through 7 generations of White Hawk women. If Sarah was wearing it when she was found, going twice, the hammer was rising. In seconds, Sarah Whitehawk would belong to Samuel Hutchins, and whatever slim chance she had of reclaiming her birthright would vanish forever. Jack thought of his sister, of all the girls who'd disappeared into the darkness while good men stood by and did nothing. He thought of the $37 in his pocket and the choice between salvation and damnation. $200, he heard himself say. The auction house erupted. Men jumped to their feet, shouting over each other. Women gasped and clutched their pearls. Even the auctioneer looked stunned, his gavel frozen in midair. But Jack only had eyes for Sarah. She was staring at him with naked disbelief, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming a single word over and over. Why? Hutchins' face had gone purple with rage. "You lying son of a bitch," he snarled. "You don't have $200. Hell, you don't have 20. Jack met his glare without flinching. "Then call my bluff." The silence stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Everyone in the auction house knew Jack was lying. Everyone knew this was the stupidest thing any man had ever done in the history of Montana Territory. Everyone knew he was about to get himself killed over a girl he didn't even know. But Sarah was still staring at him with those burning eyes, and Jack realized he didn't care about the money, or Hutchins, or the consequences of what he'd just done. He cared about the fact that someone who might be the last living member of one of the most respected families in the territory was about to be sold like cattle to a man who would destroy whatever was left of her soul. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. "Do I hear 210? Hutchins opened his mouth, then closed it. $200 was serious money, enough to buy a small ranch or a year's worth of girls from desperate families. His cold eyes never left Jack's face as he slowly shook his head and sat down. "Sold." The gavel cracked like a gunshot. "To the gentleman for $200. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement and speculation. Jack walked toward the pen on unsteady legs, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what he'd just committed to. $200. He'd just promised to pay $200 he didn't have for a girl who might or might not be who he thought she was. Sarah stood frozen as he approached, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been recognition. When he reached for the rope binding her wrists, she didn't pull away. "My name is Jackson Rivers," he said quietly, "and I think it's time you came home." The walk to Jack's modest cabin felt like the longest mile Sarah had ever traveled. Her bare feet found a purchase on the familiar dirt road, but everything else about this moment seemed impossibly foreign. The man beside her, Jackson Rivers, moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to this harsh Montana landscape, yet she caught him stealing glances at her as if trying to solve a puzzle written in a language he'd forgotten. The drunk man who'd raised her for 3 years was already disappearing into the amber haze of late afternoon, his $200 burning a hole in his pocket and his conscience. Sarah had watched him walk away without a backward glance, and the finality of it hit her like a physical blow. Whatever safety she'd found in those years of silence and servitude was gone forever. "You don't have to be afraid," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man unaccustomed to gentle conversation. "I'm not like Hutchins. I won't hurt you." Sarah wanted to believe him, but 3 years of hard lessons had taught her that men's words meant little when weighed against their actions. Still, there was something different about this one. The way he'd stepped forward at the auction, risking everything for a stranger. It reminded her of stories her grandmother used to tell, back when she still had a grandmother, back when she still had stories to remember. Jack's cabin sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that sang with snowmelt from the distant peaks. It was small but well built, with a stone chimney and windows that caught the dying light like friendly eyes. Sarah had lived in worse places, much worse, but something about this modest home made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. "There's a spare room in back," Jack said, dismounting from his horse and tying the reins to a weathered hitching post. "Used to belong to my—" He paused, his jaw working as if the next words were too heavy to lift. "It's yours now, for as long as you need it." Sarah slid down from the horse's back, her legs trembling with exhaustion and shock. The silver locket at her throat felt heavier than usual, its familiar weight a reminder of all the questions she'd spent 3 years trying not to ask. Who had she been before Caleb Morse found her half dead by the creek? Why did her dreams overflow with faces she couldn't quite remember, and voices speaking in languages she shouldn't understand? Jack was studying her again, his dark eyes intense but not unkind. "That locket," he said carefully. "Where did you get it?" Sarah's hand flew to her throat, fingers closing protectively around the tarnished silver. It was the only thing she owned that felt truly hers, the only connection to whatever life she'd had before the fever took her memories. "I don't remember," she whispered, the words feeling strange and rusty from disuse. She hadn't spoken this much in months. "May I see it?" The request was gentle, but Sarah still hesitated. The locket was private, sacred somehow. The few times Caleb had tried to examine it, she'd hidden it away until he stopped asking. But Jack's expression held none of Caleb's drunken curiosity or the predatory hunger she'd seen in Hutchins' eyes. This was different. This was important. With shaking fingers, she lifted the chain over her head and placed it in Jack's calloused palm. The moment the silver touched his skin, Jack went perfectly still. His breathing stopped. His eyes widened with something that looked like recognition, followed immediately by horror. When he looked up at her, Sarah saw tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "I know this locket." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah gripped the hitching post to keep from falling as Jack turned the locket over in his hands, tracing the intricate beadwork patterns with reverent fingers. His lips moved silently, as if he were reciting something from memory. "My grandmother made this," he said, his voice barely audible. "Gave it to her daughter when she married. It's been in the Whitehawk family for 7 generations." He looked up at Sarah with eyes full of impossible hope and devastating certainty. "You're not just Sarah Whitehawk. You're Sarah Whitehawk, granddaughter of Iron Bear, last surviving member of one of the most powerful families in the Montana Territory." Sarah's knees gave out. She sank to the dusty ground, her mind reeling as fragments of buried memories began clawing their way to the surface. A woman's voice singing lullabies in Lakota. Strong hands teaching her to braid her hair. The smell of sage smoke and sweet grass. A man with kind eyes and silver hair calling her Little Hawk in a language that felt like coming home. "No," she gasped. "That's not... I can't be... They're all dead. The whole family died in the raid 15 years ago. Everyone knows that." Jack knelt beside her, his face grave. Everyone was wrong. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a faded daguerreotype, a family portrait showing a distinguished older man in traditional Lakota dress standing beside a beautiful woman holding 2 small children. "This is Iron Bear and his daughter, Mary Whitehawk Rivers. Those children are her son and daughter." Sarah stared at the photograph, her heart hammering against her ribs. The little girl in the picture had her eyes, her nose, her stubborn chin, but it was the boy who made her breath catch in her throat. Even at age 7 or 8, his face was unmistakably familiar. "That's you," she whispered, looking up at Jack with dawning comprehension. "You're the boy in the picture." Jack nodded, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "My name is Jackson Rivers Whitehawk. Mary was my mother. Iron Bear was my grandfather." His voice broke. "And you, Sarah, are my little sister." The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah doubled over, gasping for air as 15 years of buried trauma came rushing back in a torrent of fire and blood and screaming. She remembered now. Remembered the night riders with their torches and guns, the smell of burning timber, her mother's desperate commands to run and hide. She remembered Jackson trying to protect her, remembered being separated in the chaos, remembered waking up weeks later with no memory of who she was or where she belonged. "The raid," she choked out. "They said everyone died. Almost everyone did." Jack's voice was hollow with old grief. "Mother, grandfather, most of our cousins and aunts. I survived because I was thrown from my horse and knocked unconscious. When I woke up, the house was ashes and everyone I loved was gone. I spent 5 years looking for you, following every rumor and whisper, finally gave up hope and tried to build a new life." Sarah looked up at him through her tears, seeing past the weathered cowboy exterior to the frightened boy who'd lost everything in one terrible night. "I remember you," she whispered. "You taught me to skip stones. You called me Sparrow because I was always chattering." Jack's composure finally cracked completely. He gathered her into his arms, holding her with the desperate relief of someone who'd been given back a piece of their soul they thought was lost forever. "I never stopped looking," he sobbed into her hair. "Not really. Every face in every crowd, every girl with dark hair. I always hoped." They clung to each other in the fading light, two broken pieces of the same shattered family finally finding their way back together. But even through the overwhelming joy of reunion, Sarah felt a chill of premonition. If Jack was alive, if she was alive, then the stories about the Whitehawk massacre weren't the whole truth. Someone had wanted their family destroyed, and that someone might still be out there. "Jack," she said quietly, "if we survived, maybe others did too. And if others survived—" She didn't finish the thought, but she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. The people who'd destroyed their family 15 years ago might not be finished with the Whitehawks yet. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains when Jack finally released Sarah from their desperate embrace. The temperature was dropping fast, and he could see her shivering in the thin dress that was all she owned. But it wasn't just the cold making her tremble. The weight of recovered memories was taking its toll, and he recognized the hollow look creeping back into her eyes. "Come inside," he said gently, helping her to her feet. "You need food and rest. We can figure out the rest tomorrow." The cabin's interior was Spartan but clean, furnished with handmade furniture and warmed by a stone fireplace that Jack quickly coaxed into life. Sarah stood in the center of the main room, looking lost and overwhelmed, her hands clutching the silver locket like a lifeline. Every few seconds she would touch something, the rough-hewn table, a faded photograph on the mantel, the colorful Navajo blanket draped over the single chair, as if testing whether this new reality was solid enough to trust. Jack busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread, stealing glances at his sister when he thought she wasn't looking. The years had changed her dramatically from the chattering 5-year-old he remembered. This Sarah was guarded, careful, marked by experiences he could only imagine. But sometimes, when the firelight caught her face just right, he could see traces of the little girl who used to follow him everywhere, demanding stories and attention with the absolute confidence that her big brother would always have time for her. "Do you remember the stories grandmother used to tell?" he asked quietly, setting a steaming bowl before her. "About the first Whitehawk woman who received the locket?" Sarah's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. For a moment Jack thought she wouldn't answer. Then, In a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. She was called Singing Crow. The locket was a wedding gift from her husband's family, but she said it held the spirits of all the White Hawk women who came before and all who would come after. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She said as long as a White Hawk woman wore it, the family would never truly die. Jack's throat constricted with emotion. She remembered, despite everything she'd endured, despite the years of silence and the trauma that had buried her identity so deep, she still carried their grandmother's stories. "Grandmother was right," he said, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "You wearing that locket kept our family alive, kept hope alive." Sarah set down her spoon and studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Jack, what happened to you after the raid? How did you survive?" The question he'd been dreading. Jack stared into the fire, organizing 15 years of pain and mistakes into something resembling a coherent narrative. "I was 12 when I woke up in the ashes. Spent 3 days buried under debris, drinking rainwater and eating charred corn. When I finally dug myself out, everything was gone. Our house, the barns, the livestock, bodies everywhere." Sarah's face went pale, but she didn't look away. "I found Mother near the main house. She'd been shot trying to reach the root cellar where we stored emergency supplies. Grandfather was in the study, along with Uncle Thomas and 2 of our cousins. They'd made a stand there, fought to the end." Jack's voice broke slightly. "I spent 2 weeks burying everyone I could find. You weren't among the bodies, but there was so much." He swallowed hard. "So much blood and ash, I thought maybe you'd been consumed in the fires. But you kept looking. For 5 years, I followed every rumor, every whisper about missing children or unidentified girls, traveled from the Canadian border to Colorado, checking orphanages, trading posts, anywhere a lost child might end up. Finally, a cavalry sergeant told me to accept that you were dead and move on with my life." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more mature. "Someone wanted our family destroyed. This wasn't random violence or even a robbery gone wrong. This was planned, systematic." Jack nodded grimly. "I came to the same conclusion after years of investigating. Too many coincidences. The raiders knew exactly where to find our money, our weapons, our horses. They knew which buildings to burn first and which family members posed the greatest threat. Someone gave them detailed information about the ranch. Someone we trusted." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Both siblings understood the implications. Somewhere out there was a person who had betrayed their family so thoroughly that 15 people died and 2 children lost everything they'd ever known. Someone who might still be alive, still be a threat. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out into the darkness. "Jack, there's something else. Something I haven't told you about the night I was found by Caleb Morse." Jack felt his blood chill at her tone. "What is it?" "I wasn't alone by the creek. There was a man with me, older, with silver hair and a scar across his left cheek. He was badly wounded, dying from a gunshot to the chest. Before he passed, he kept repeating the same thing over and over. 'Tell Iron Bear. Tell him Ezekiel Blackfeather has come home to settle the debt.'" The bowl in Jack's hands shattered against the floor. He stood so violently, his chair toppled backward, his face gone white with shock and recognition. "Jesus Christ, Sarah, you're certain that's what he said? Ezekiel Blackfeather? You know that name." "Know it." Jack laughed bitterly. "Ezekiel Blackfeather is our grandfather's brother, our great-uncle. He was exiled from the tribe 25 years ago for murdering a medicine man during a ceremony. Grandfather testified against him at the tribal council." Jack began pacing, his mind racing through the implications. If he's alive, if he's been planning revenge all this time, Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. Jack, what if the raid wasn't the end of his plan? What if it was just the beginning? Before Jack could answer, a sound from outside made them both freeze, the distinctive creak of saddle leather and the soft whinny of horses being reined to a halt. Jack moved to the window and carefully pushed aside the curtain. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water. 6 men on horseback surrounded the cabin, their faces hidden by bandanas and their weapons already drawn. At their head sat a figure Jack recognized from wanted posters in every town from Billings to Bozeman. Samuel Hutchins, the brothel keeper from the auction, accompanied by some of the most dangerous men in the Montana Territory. "Appears we have company," Hutchins called out, his voice carrying easily through the thin cabin walls. "Jackson Rivers, I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Jack grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and checked the load. 6 bullets, 6 men. Not good odds, especially with Sarah to protect. "Stay low and get behind the stove," he whispered urgently. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you." Sarah shook her head fiercely. "I'm not hiding while you fight my battles. You're not trained for this kind of—" "Neither were you at 12, but you survived." Sarah's voice carried a steely determination that reminded Jack powerfully of their grandfather. "We're stronger together than apart. That's what family means." Outside, Hutchins was growing impatient. "I know you can hear me in there, Breed. You made a fool of me at that auction, cost me a valuable piece of property. Now I'm here to collect what's mine, plus interest for the inconvenience." Jack's mind raced through their options. The cabin had 2 windows and 1 door, easily covered by 6 men. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. Their only advantages were interior position and the element of surprise. "Sarah," he whispered, "can you still shoot?" She nodded, and Jack saw something flicker in her eyes that he remembered from their childhood, the fierce joy she used to take in competing with him at everything from horse racing to target practice. "Good," Jack said, handing her his spare pistol. "Because I have a feeling this is about to get very ugly." Outside, metal clicked against metal as 6 men cocked their weapons. The first shot shattered the window above Sarah's head, sending glass cascading across the wooden floor like deadly rain. Jack dove behind the overturned table, pulling Sarah down with him as bullets punched through the cabin walls with explosive force. The air filled with splinters and dust as Hutchins' men opened fire from 3 sides, their coordinated assault designed to pin the siblings down while the brothel keeper closed in for the kill. "So much for negotiation," Jack muttered, checking his rifle's sight picture through a gap in the cabin's chinking. He could see muzzle flashes winking in the darkness like malevolent fireflies, but the shooters had positioned themselves behind trees and rocks, making clean shots nearly impossible. Sarah crawled to the broken window, keeping low as she assessed their situation. "6 men, like you said. 2 by the creek, 2 near the corral, 1 behind your woodpile, and Hutchins himself is moving toward the door." Her voice was remarkably steady for someone who'd been living as a virtual slave just hours before. "They're trying to box us in." Another volley of shots peppered the cabin's walls. 1 bullet passed so close to Jack's ear he felt the heat of its passage. These men weren't trying to wound or capture, they were shooting to kill, which meant whatever Hutchins wanted from Sarah was worth more to him dead than alive. "The locket," Sarah whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. "He knows what it means, knows who I am." Jack's blood ran cold as the implications hit him. If Hutchins knew Sarah was the lost Whitehawk heiress, then her identity wasn't as secret as they'd hoped. Word would spread quickly through the territory's criminal networks, drawing every fortune hunter and murderer within 100 miles to their door. They had to end this tonight, or they'd spend the rest of their lives running from men like Hutchins. A shadow moved past the window, someone circling around to flank them. Jack sighted carefully and squeezed the trigger. The shadow stumbled and fell with a scream that cut through the gunfire like a blade. One down, 5 to go. Nice shot, Sarah said, her own pistol trained on the door. But they're still coming. The sound of splintering wood announced Hutchins' assault on the cabin's front entrance. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron straps, but it wouldn't hold forever against determined attackers. Jack counted the blows. 6 heavy impacts that shook the entire structure. On the 7th, something gave way with a sound like breaking bones. "Rivers!" Hutchins bellowed from outside. "Send out the girl and we'll make this quick. Keep fighting and I'll make sure she suffers before she dies." Sarah's jaw tightened with cold fury. "Let me talk to him." "Absolutely not. He wants me alive, Jack. That gives us leverage." She was already moving toward the door before he could stop her. "Hutchins, I know what you really want." The shooting stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Jack could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Do you now, little princess?" Hutchins' voice carried a mocking edge. "Enlighten me. You think I'm Sarah Whitehawk, granddaughter of Iron Bear? You think that locket around my neck makes me the rightful heir to 50,000 acres of prime grazing land?" Sarah's voice carried clearly through the damaged door. "You're half right." Jack stared at his sister in shock. What was she doing? "I am Sarah Whitehawk," she continued. "But the locket doesn't make me the heir. It makes me the witness." A long pause. Then, witness to what? To the truth about who really ordered the massacre 15 years ago. Who paid the raiders? Who's been systematically hunting down every surviving member of my family? Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried perfectly in the still night air. "I know who you work for, Hutchins, and he's going to be very unhappy when he learns you've been freelancing on his territory." The silence stretched so long Jack began to wonder if Hutchins had somehow vanished into the night. Then the brothel keeper's voice returned, but all the mockery had gone out of it. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Tell me, how did you know to be at that auction today? How did you know exactly which girl to bid on?" Sarah moved closer to the door, ignoring Jack's frantic gestures to get back. "Someone told you I'd be there. Someone who's been tracking me for years, waiting for the right moment to strike." Another long pause. When Hutchins spoke again, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Even if what you're saying is true, you've got no proof. Don't I?" Sarah reached into her dress and pulled out something Jack hadn't noticed before. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and stained with what looked like dried blood. 15 years ago, a dying man gave me more than just a message about Ezekiel Blackfeather. He gave me this." She held the paper up to the window where the firelight could illuminate it. Even from his position behind the table, Jack could see it was covered with names, dates, and what looked like financial figures, a ledger of some kind. "This is a record of payments made to the Crane Brothers gang for services rendered to various cattle barons throughout the Montana Territory." Sarah's voice gained strength as she spoke. "Including a very substantial payment made in February 1868 for what's described as permanent removal of competing land claims in the Bitterroot Valley." Jack's mind reeled. The Crane Brothers. He'd heard that name whispered in saloons and trading posts, a gang of murderers and thieves who'd terrorized the territory for years before vanishing without a trace. If they were the ones who'd attacked the White Hawk Ranch, the payment was authorized by someone with the initials EB, Sarah continued relentlessly. Someone who needed the White Hawks eliminated so he could claim their land for himself. Someone who spent the last 15 years building an empire on the graves of my family. "You're lying." But Hutchins' voice lacked conviction. "Ezekiel Blackfeather didn't die in that creek 15 years ago, did he? He survived just like Jack and I did. And he's been waiting, planning, building his strength for the day he could finish what he started. Sarah's voice turned hard as winter iron. But he didn't count on his own hired killers keeping records. Didn't count on one of the Crane brothers having a conscience at the end. Jack understood now. The dying man Sarah had been found with wasn't just any victim of the raid. He'd been one of the raiders himself, mortally wounded and racked with guilt over what he'd participated in. The ledger was his confession, his attempt to make amends for the innocent blood on his hands. Outside, Jack could hear hushed voices as Hutchins conferred with his remaining men. The dynamic had shifted completely. Sarah had turned what should have been a simple assassination into something much more complex and dangerous. "All right," Hutchins called out finally. "Let's say you're telling the truth. Let's say you have proof that could bring down some very powerful people. What do you want?" "Safe passage out of the territory for my brother and me. In exchange, you never saw us tonight. You never heard of Sarah Whitehawk. As far as anyone knows, we died in this cabin. And the ledger?" Sarah smiled grimly. "Insurance. Stored somewhere safe with instructions to be delivered to the territorial authorities if anything happens to us." Another conference outside. Jack could feel the tension building toward some kind of resolution. Either Hutchins would accept Sarah's terms, or this was about to turn into a bloodbath that would leave all of them dead. "Deal," Hutchins said finally. "But I want to see that ledger first. Proof you're not bluffing." Sarah looked back at Jack, and he saw something in her eyes that made his stomach drop. She wasn't holding a confession from one of the Crane brothers. She was holding a blank piece of paper stained with her own blood from where she'd cut her finger on the broken window glass. She'd been bluffing the entire time. And now she had to make good on her lie, or they were all going to die. Sarah's hand trembled as she held up the blood-stained paper, praying the darkness would hide its blank surface from Hutchins's scrutinizing eyes. Jack watched in horrified fascination as his sister prepared to stake both their lives on a desperate gamble. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. "Slide it under the door," Hutchins commanded, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Nice and slow." Sarah glanced back at Jack one final time, her eyes conveying a message he understood with crystalline clarity. "Be ready for anything." Then she knelt by the damaged door and carefully pushed the folded paper through the gap at its base. Jack counted heartbeats while Hutchins examined their fabricated evidence. 1, 2, 3. The brothel keeper was undoubtedly holding the paper up to whatever moonlight filtered through the trees, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. 4, 5, 6. Any second now he would realize he'd been played, and all hell would break loose. "Well, I'll be damned," Hutchins said finally, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. "You weren't bluffing after all." Jack nearly choked on his own breath. How was that possible? The paper was blank except for Sarah's blood. Unless... Understanding hit him like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't been carrying a blank piece of paper at all. During those 3 years living with Caleb Morse, she must have hidden the real ledger so well that even she had forgotten about it until this moment of desperate need. The dying member of the Crane brothers had indeed given her proof of Ezekiel Blackfeather's treachery, and she'd kept it safe all these years without fully understanding its significance. "The names in this ledger," Hutchins continued, his voice now tinged with something that might have been fear. "Some of these men are still alive, still powerful. They wouldn't take kindly to having their past business arrangements made public." "Now you understand why we need to disappear," Sarah replied smoothly. "And why it's in everyone's best interest to let us go. But Jack detected something different in Hutchins' tone now, a calculating quality that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The brothel keeper wasn't afraid anymore. He was planning something. "Here's the problem with your proposal, little princess," Hutchins said, his voice returning to its earlier mocking cadence. "You're assuming I work for Blackfeather. But what if I told you that old bastard has been dead for 2 years? What if I told you there's a new power in the territory now, someone who'd pay handsomely for both you and that ledger?" Sarah's face went pale. "You're lying, am I? Ezekiel Blackfeather died of consumption in a Denver brothel, coughing up blood and cursing the White Hawk name with his last breath. The man I work for bought up all his debts, all his claims, all his unfinished business." Hutchins chuckled darkly. "Including his obsession with wiping out the last of your bloodline." Jack's mind raced through the implications. If Blackfeather was truly dead, then someone else had inherited his vendetta against the White Hawk family. Someone with the resources and connections to track Sarah's movements, to arrange for her appearance at the auction, to orchestrate this entire deadly charade. "Who?" Sarah demanded. "Who's pulling your strings, Hutchins?" "Someone you know very well, I suspect. Someone who's been waiting 15 years for this moment." The brothel keeper's voice carried a note of sadistic pleasure. "Someone who's been playing a much longer game than any of us realized." A new voice cut through the night air like a blade through silk, cultured, educated, carrying the unmistakable accent of Eastern money and breeding. "That would be me, Miss Whitehawk." Jack felt his blood turn to ice as a figure stepped into the circle of firelight visible through the broken window, tall, distinguished, wearing an expensive suit despite the late hour and remote location. The man moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to having others step out of his way. "Allow me to introduce myself," the newcomer said with mock courtesy. "Judge Marcus Thornfield, territorial magistrate and as of 2 years ago sole owner of the Blackfeather estate and all its associated obligations." Sarah's sharp intake of breath told Jack she recognized the name. Judge Thornfield was one of the most powerful men in the Montana Territory, known for his iron-fisted control over land disputes and mining claims. He'd built his reputation as an incorruptible defender of law and order, but apparently that reputation was built on carefully constructed lies. "You," Sarah whispered, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "You were the one who signed the death certificates for our family. You were the one who declared the White Hawk lands abandoned and available for purchase." "Quite correct," Thornfield said smoothly, "though I prefer to think of it as tidying up loose ends. Your grandfather's death left a power vacuum in the territory, and nature abhors a vacuum. I simply stepped in to provide the stability and leadership the region required." Jack raised his rifle, sighting on Thornfield's chest through the gap in the cabin's chinking. The range was manageable, maybe 30 yards, and the judge was standing perfectly still, confident in his apparent invulnerability. One shot would end this nightmare before it could spread any further. But Sarah grabbed his arm, shaking her head urgently. "He's not alone," she whispered. "Listen." Jack strained his ears and heard what she meant, the soft creak of leather and metal that indicated multiple armed men positioned around the cabin's perimeter. Thornfield had brought an army with him, and they were all waiting for an excuse to turn the modest dwelling into a slaughterhouse. "I must admit, Miss Whitehawk, you've proven more resourceful than I anticipated," Thornfield continued conversationally. "When Hutchins informed me of your dramatic appearance at today's auction, I feared my carefully laid plans might be compromised. But as it turns out, your survival presents an opportunity I hadn't considered." "What kind of opportunity?" Sarah asked, though Jack could hear the dread in her voice. "A wedding, of course, between the last surviving White Hawk heir and a respectable member of the territorial government. Think of it, a romantic story of lost love reunited, of old wounds finally healed through the sacred bond of matrimony. Thornfield's smile was visible even in the dim light, cold and predatory. As your husband, I would naturally assume control of all Whitehawk assets and properties. The transfer would be completely legal, completely legitimate. The casual cruelty of it took Jack's breath away. Thornfield wasn't just planning to kill them. He was planning to force Sarah into a mockery of marriage first, using the law itself as a weapon to legitimize his theft of their family's legacy. "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked, though they all knew the answer. "Then you and your brother will suffer a tragic accident during your escape attempt." So sad, really. Two young people, reunited after years of separation, struck down just as they were beginning to build a new life together. Thornfield's voice carried no emotion whatsoever, as if he were discussing the weather rather than premeditated murder. Jack's finger tightened on his rifle's trigger. Even surrounded and outnumbered, he wasn't going to let this monster lay hands on his sister. Better to go down fighting than to watch Sarah be subjected to whatever hell Thornfield had planned for her. But before he could fire, Sarah stepped directly into his line of sight, blocking any chance of a clean shot. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "Sarah, no. I'll marry you, Judge Thornfield. But I have conditions." Jack stared at his sister in horror and disbelief. After everything they'd been through, after finally finding each other again, she was going to surrender to this monster. It didn't make sense. Sarah was a fighter, not someone who gave up at the first sign of trouble. Unless she wasn't giving up at all. Unless this was just another gamble, another desperate play for time and advantage in a game where the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. "I'm listening," Thornfield said, clearly intrigued by this unexpected development. Sarah straightened her shoulders, and Jack saw something flicker in her eyes, the same fierce determination that had gotten them through the night so far. "First, my brother walks away from this alive and unharmed. Second, the ceremony is conducted by a real minister, not some bought and paid for accomplice. And third," she paused, letting the tension build, "I want to see my family's graves before I become your wife." Judge Thornfield's laugh carried the brittle edge of breaking glass. How touching. The condemned woman wishes to pay her respects to the dead before joining them in matrimony. He stepped closer to the cabin, his polished boots crunching on fallen leaves. "Very well, Miss Whitehawk. I suppose even the most hardened criminal deserves a final meal." Jack felt Sarah's hand brush against his arm, a subtle warning to stay ready. Whatever she was planning, it involved more than just buying time. The old Whitehawk burial ground was 15 miles north, in a sacred grove that had been protected by tribal law for generations. If Thornfield agreed to take them there, it would mean traveling through terrain that favored defenders over attackers. "The ceremony will take place at sunrise tomorrow," Thornfield continued, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to reshaping the world to his desires. "That should give us enough time to visit your precious graves and arrange for a proper minister. Reverend Morrison owes me several favors. I'm certain he'll be delighted to perform the service." Sarah's shoulders stiffened at the mention of Morrison's name. Jack remembered the preacher from their childhood, a weak man who'd always been more concerned with the size of his congregation's donations than the state of their souls. If Morrison was involved, it meant Thornfield's corruption ran deeper than anyone had suspected. "What about the ledger?" Hutchins interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "That document could still cause problems for a lot of important people." "Leave that to me," Thornfield replied smoothly. "Once Miss Whitehawk becomes my wife, all her possessions will naturally transfer to my control, including any inconvenient historical documents she might have inherited." The cold calculation in his voice made Jack's skin crawl. And Thornfield had already thought through every angle, anticipated every possible complication. This wasn't the desperate gamble of a man backed into a corner, it was the methodical execution of a plan that had been years in the making. "My brother," Sarah said quietly, "you haven't agreed to my first condition." "Ah, yes. The troublesome Jackson Rivers Whitehawk." Thornfield turned his attention to Jack, studying him with the detached interest of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "Tell me, young man, what exactly do you plan to do with your life once you walk away from here?" The question caught Jack off guard. He'd expected threats, not career counseling from a corrupt judge. "I'll find work somewhere. Start over." "With what skills? What references? What future?" Thornfield shook his head sadly. "You're a half-breed cowboy with no education, no connections, and no prospects. In 5 years you'll be dead in a saloon fight or rotting in territorial prison." "Is that really the life your sister should sacrifice herself to preserve?" Jack felt the barb hit home. Everything Thornfield said was true. Without the Whitehawk name and fortune, he was just another drifter in a territory full of desperate men. But Sarah's hand found his again, squeezing gently, reminding him that some things mattered more than money or status. "At least I'll be free," Jack said simply. "Freedom." Thornfield rolled the word around in his mouth like he was tasting something bitter. Such an American concept, and such an expensive one. Do you know how much it costs to maintain your freedom in this territory? To ensure that the right judges hear your cases, that the right sheriffs investigate your crimes, that the right politicians remember your interests when they're writing new laws? The judge began pacing, his expensive shoes clicking against the frozen ground. "I've spent 20 years building a network that spans from Helena to Denver. Judges, politicians, businessmen, even some of the tribal leaders, all working together to bring civilization and prosperity to this wilderness. Your grandfather understood that. He was part of that network once, before his conscience got the better of him." Jack felt Sarah tense beside him. This was new information, a piece of family history neither of them had known about. "Iron Bear was no saint," Thornfield continued, seemingly oblivious to the emotional impact of his words. "He made his fortune the same way I did, by eliminating competitors and consolidating power. The difference was that he developed scruples in his old age, started talking about legacy and justice and other inconvenient principles." "So you had him killed?" Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet. "I had a problem solved. There's a difference." Thornfield stopped pacing and fixed his cold gaze on her. "Your grandfather was preparing to expose the entire network to bring down 20 years of careful work because he'd suddenly decided that progress was more important than profit. I couldn't allow that." Jack's rifle barrel shifted slightly, tracking Thornfield's movement. The judge was getting careless, moving closer to the cabin in his eagerness to justify his actions. One clean shot would end this nightmare, but Jack could see at least 3 other gunmen positioned behind trees, their weapons trained on the windows. "The irony is that his death accomplished nothing," Thornfield said with genuine amusement. "The land still needed to be developed. The resources still needed to be extracted. The only difference was that I got rich instead of him." "And 15 innocent people died," Sarah said. 15 obstacles were removed, including 2 children who would have grown up to cause exactly the kind of problems you're causing now." Thornfield's smile turned predatory. "Though I must admit, your survival has provided an unexpected opportunity to legitimize my claim to the Whitehawk holdings. Marriage is so much more civilized than murder, don't you think?" Jack watched his sister's face in the firelight, seeing the rage building behind her carefully controlled expression. Sarah was reaching her breaking point, and when she snapped, the results were going to be explosive. "You're forgetting something important," she said quietly. "Am I?" Please, enlighten me. The ledger isn't the only evidence of your crimes. Sarah reached into her dress and pulled out a small object that glinted in the firelight, a brass button, tarnished with age but still recognizable. This came from the uniform of one of your hired killers. The man who died by the creek wasn't just carrying records of payments, he was carrying proof of who those payments came from. Jack recognized the button immediately. It was military issue, but not from any regular army unit. It was from the territorial militia, the private force that answered directly to the territorial government. If Sarah was right, if the Crane brothers had been working as official agents rather than independent contractors. "You're lying," Thornfield said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Am I? This button was cut from the coat of the man who murdered my mother. He was wearing a militia uniform when he did it, operating under official orders signed by a territorial magistrate." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke, feeding off Thornfield's obvious discomfort. "How do you think the federal authorities would react to learning that territorial officials were using government resources to commit genocide against Native families?" The silence stretched long enough for Jack to count his own heartbeats. When Thornfield finally spoke, his cultured facade had cracked, revealing something ugly underneath. "Even if that's true, even if you could prove it, what makes you think the federal government cares about a few dead Indians?" His voice carried a vicious edge now. "Washington has been trying to clear this territory for settlement for 20 years. They'd probably give me a medal for eliminating the White Hawks." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But they might feel differently about a territorial judge who's been skimming mining revenues and selling land grants to the highest bidder, especially if that judge has been operating his own private army without federal oversight." Jack saw Thornfield's face go pale in the moonlight. Sarah had hit something vital, some secret fear that the corrupt judge had been carrying for years. "You don't know what you're talking about," Thornfield snarled. "Don't I? The federal investigators have been asking questions about discrepancies in territorial accounts, about mining claims that were issued without proper surveys, about militia units that don't appear on any official roster." Sarah smiled coldly. "Did you really think you could steal from Washington without someone eventually noticing?" The night exploded into motion as Thornfield reached for his weapon, his composure finally shattered by the realization that his carefully constructed empire was already crumbling. Jack's rifle cracked like thunder, the bullet taking the corrupt judge in the shoulder and spinning him around. But Thornfield's men were already moving, their weapons blazing in the darkness, as the final battle for the White Hawk legacy began in earnest. Gunfire erupted like thunder across the Montana wilderness as Jack's bullet found its mark in Thornfield's shoulder. The corrupt judge spun backward with a scream of pain and rage, his expensive coat blooming crimson in the moonlight. But even wounded, he was shouting orders to his men, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "Kill them both! No witnesses!" Sarah threw herself behind the stone fireplace as bullets shattered the remaining windows, filling the cabin with flying glass and splinters. The air became thick with gun smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood where stray shots had ignited the dry timber walls. Jack rolled behind an overturned chest, his rifle already tracking toward the muzzle flashes visible through the broken windows. "How many shots do you have left?" Sarah called over the deafening roar of gunfire. "4 in the rifle, 6 in my pistol," Jack replied, methodically working the lever action. "You? 5 bullets and a prayer." Through the chaos, Jack could hear Hutchins barking orders from somewhere near the creek. "Surround the cabin! Don't let them escape through the back!" The brothel keeper's voice carried the sharp edge of panic. Thornfield's injury had changed the dynamic of their carefully planned ambush, turning it into a desperate firefight where anything could happen. Jack sighted on a shadow moving between the trees and squeezed off another shot. The shadow stumbled and fell, but immediately another gunman took his place, pouring lead through the cabin's walls with methodical precision. These weren't common criminals or drunken cowboys. They were professional killers who knew their business. Sarah crawled to the window on the cabin's north side, risking a quick glance toward the tree line. "Jack, there's something wrong here." "I count at least 8 men out there, but Thornfield only brought 6. Before Jack could respond, a new voice cut through the night, deeper, older, carrying an authority that made even Thornfield's men pause their assault. "That's because he didn't bring them all." Jack's blood turned to ice water as he recognized the voice. It belonged to a ghost, a man who was supposed to have died in a Denver brothel 2 years ago. Ezekiel Blackfeather stepped into the circle of firelight, very much alive despite Thornfield's claims, his weathered face bearing the unmistakable features of White Hawk blood. "Hello, nephew," Blackfeather said, his cold gaze fixed on Jack through the broken window. "Hello, niece. It's time we had a family reunion." Sarah's sharp intake of breath told Jack she understood the implications immediately. If Blackfeather was alive, if he'd been playing dead while Thornfield built his criminal empire, then everything they thought they knew about their situation was wrong. This wasn't just about corrupt judges and stolen land anymore. This was about family, blood, and a vendetta that stretched back 25 years. "You're supposed to be dead," Thornfield snarled from where he crouched behind a fallen log, clutching his wounded shoulder. "I have certificates, witness statements." "You have paperwork," Blackfeather corrected with cold amusement. "Expensive paperwork that I paid good money to have falsified. Did you really think I would trust my revenge to a soft-handed Eastern fool like you?" Jack felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Blackfeather hadn't died in Denver. He'd staged his death and let Thornfield think he was inheriting the old man's criminal empire. Meanwhile, he'd been working in the shadows, manipulating events, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "All these years," Sarah whispered, "you've been pulling the strings." "Not all of them," Blackfeather admitted. "Thornfield had his own ambitions, his own network of corruption, but when it came to hunting down the last of Iron Bear's bloodline, I made sure to stay involved. After all, this is personal." The shooting had stopped completely now, all parties frozen by this unexpected revelation. Even Hutchins' men seemed uncertain about who they were supposed to be taking orders from. "Why?" Jack called out, his rifle still trained on the shadows beyond the firelight. "Grandfather testified against you, but that was 25 years ago. You could have built a new life anywhere in the territory." Blackfeather's laugh carried no warmth whatsoever. "A new life? Do you know what it's like to be cast out by your own people? To have your name struck from the tribal rolls, your deeds erased from the stories? Iron Bear didn't just testify against me, he destroyed everything I was, everything I had built." "You murdered a holy man during a sacred ceremony," Sarah shot back. "What did you expect?" "I expected justice." Blackfeather's composure cracked, revealing the rage that had been festering for decades. Standing Elk was a fraud, a false prophet who filled our people's heads with dreams of peace and cooperation with the white man. I saw what that cooperation would lead to: the destruction of our way of life, the theft of our land, the death of our culture. Jack risked a glance through the window and saw his great-uncle's face in the firelight, gaunt, weathered, marked by years of exile and hatred. This was what Blackfeather's quest for vengeance had cost him. He'd become the very monster the tribal council had feared he was. "So you proved their point," Jack said quietly. "You became exactly what they said you were, a killer who would murder his own people for power." "I became what was necessary," Blackfeather snarled. "While you and your sister were playing house with white families, I was building an army. While Iron Bear was making speeches about honor and tradition, I was securing our future the only way that matters, with blood and gold." "What army?" Sarah asked, though Jack could hear the dread in her voice. Blackfeather smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than his anger had been. "Did you think Hutchins and Thornfield were the extent of my network? I've spent 25 years building connections throughout the territory, corrupt officials, desperate criminals, anyone with a grudge against the established order. They all answer to me now." As if summoned by his words, more shadows began moving in the forest beyond the cabin. Jack counted at least a dozen new figures, all armed, all converging on their position with the coordinated precision of a military unit. "You see," Blackfeather continued conversationally, "I learned something important during my years of exile. The white man's greatest weakness is his assumption that he's the only one capable of long-term planning. While they were busy stealing our land piece by piece, I was preparing to take it all back in one decisive stroke." Thornfield was struggling to his feet, his face pale with blood loss and growing understanding. "You're talking about war." "I'm talking about justice. The territorial government is riddled with my people now. Judges, sheriffs, militia commanders, even some of the politicians in Helena. When the time comes, they'll all act on my orders simultaneously. The entire power structure will collapse overnight." Jack felt sick as the scope of Blackfeather's ambitions became clear. This wasn't just about revenge against the Whitehawk family. It was about overthrowing the territorial government and plunging Montana into chaos. Thousands of innocent people would die in the resulting conflict, and you need us dead to make it work, Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. "I need the Whitehawk name eliminated completely. As long as any of Iron Bear's blood survives, there will always be those who remember what we once stood for. Peace, cooperation, finding common ground between cultures." Blackfeather spat in the dirt. "Weakness that will poison my people's resolve when the war begins." The cabin walls seemed to press in around them as the full hopelessness of their situation became clear. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for the future of everyone in the Montana Territory. If Blackfeather succeeded in killing them and launching his war, the resulting bloodshed would make the original Whitehawk massacre look like a minor skirmish. "There's one thing you're forgetting, Uncle," Jack said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "What's that, nephew?" "Grandfather didn't just teach us about peace and cooperation. He also taught us how to fight." Jack's rifle cracked again, the bullet smashing into the lantern hanging from a nearby tree branch and plunging half the clearing into darkness. In the sudden chaos that followed, Sarah was already moving, her pistol blazing as she laid down, covering fire through the broken window. The final battle for the soul of the Montana Territory had begun. Message for American seniors, 55 to 68. Sometimes life hits us when we least expect it, stripping away everything we thought we knew about family, belonging, and home. Like Jack and Sarah discovering their true identities after years of believing they were alone, many of us reach our golden years only to realize that the stories we've been told about our families, our worth, and our place in the world might not be the whole truth. Maybe you felt that ache of disconnection, wondering if the people who raised you really knew you, if the sacrifices you made were seen, if the love you gave was valued. Perhaps you've discovered late in life that siblings you never knew existed were out there searching for you too, or that the family legacy you thought was lost forever might still be recoverable. The pain of feeling invisible, unheard, or forgotten doesn't diminish with age. It often deepens. But just as Jack and Sarah found each other against impossible odds, there's still time to reclaim what was lost, to fight for the connections that matter, and to discover that family isn't just about blood. It's about who's willing to stand with you when the bullets start flying. Your story isn't over yet. Questions for engagement. Have you ever discovered something about your family history that completely changed how you saw your past? What would you be willing to sacrifice to protect someone you love? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The darkness worked in their favor for exactly 30 seconds before Blackfeather's men adapted, spreading out in a wide circle around the cabin and using the remaining moonlight to coordinate their assault. Jack could hear them calling positions to each other in low voices, professional killers who'd done this kind of work before. "Sarah, we need to move," Jack whispered urgently. "They're going to burn us out." She nodded, understanding immediately. The cabin's wooden walls wouldn't stop bullets much longer, and once Blackfeather's men got organized, they'd simply set the structure on fire and pick off anyone who tried to escape the flames. They had maybe minutes before this became a death trap. "The storm cellar," Sarah said, pointing toward a barely visible wooden door set into the ground near the cabin's rear wall. "If we can reach it." "That's a dead end," Jack protested. "We'll be buried alive down there." "Not if it connects to the old mine shaft. Remember the stories Grandfather used to tell about the Underground Railroad he helped run during the war? This cabin was a station. There has to be a tunnel." Jack felt hope flicker in his chest. The Underground Railroad, a network of secret passages and safe houses that had helped escaped slaves reach freedom in Canada. Their grandfather had been part of that network, using his knowledge of the terrain to guide desperate people through hostile territory. If there really was a tunnel beneath the cabin. A bottle filled with kerosene crashed through the remaining window, spilling flaming liquid across the wooden floor. Within seconds, the cabin's interior was filling with smoke and dancing shadows as the fire began to spread. "Move!" Jack shouted, emptying his rifle through the window to provide covering fire, while Sarah darted toward the back door. She made it halfway before a bullet splintered the wooden frame inches from her head, driving her back behind the overturned table. Outside, Hutchins was rallying his men for a final assault. "Pour it on! Don't give them a chance to breathe." The gunfire became continuous, a wall of lead that made any movement impossible. Jack could feel the heat of the flames on his back as the fire spread across the cabin's interior. In minutes, the smoke would become too thick to breathe. They were running out of time and options. That's when Sarah did something that nearly stopped Jack's heart. She stood up, walked calmly to the burning window, and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the clearing. "Uncle Ezekiel, I have a proposition for you." The shooting stopped abruptly. Even Blackfeather seemed stunned by her audacity. "You have nothing to bargain with, niece," he called back. "Don't I? You want the White Hawk name destroyed, but you're going about it all wrong. Killing us makes us martyrs. It gives people something to rally around when your war begins." Sarah's voice carried the same steel authority that Jack remembered from their grandfather. "But if I surrender willingly, if I publicly renounce the White Hawk name and acknowledge you as the rightful heir to our grandfather's legacy—" "Sarah, no," Jack breathed, understanding what she was planning. "Then you get everything you want without creating the very symbol of resistance you're trying to prevent," she continued. "I'll stand before the tribal council and tell them that Iron Bear was wrong to exile you. I'll legitimize your claim to leadership." Blackfeather was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the offer. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "And your brother?" "Dies here tonight. Killed while resisting arrest by territorial marshals acting on your orders. You'll be the grieving great-uncle who tried to save his wayward nephew, but arrived too late." Jack stared at his sister in horror and admiration. She was offering to sacrifice herself to save him, but more than that, she was playing for time, while the cabin burned around them. The smoke was getting thicker, providing cover for whatever desperate plan she was hatching. "It's an interesting proposal," Blackfeather admitted. "But how do I know you won't simply recant once you're safely before the tribal council?" "Because you'll have insurance," Sarah said, moving closer to the window. "The real ledger, not the one I showed Hutchins. That was just a piece of blood-stained paper. but I do have the actual records from the Crane Brothers raids. Every payment, every target, every detail of how you orchestrated the destruction of our family." Jack's blood ran cold. If Sarah was telling the truth, if she really did have evidence that could implicate dozens of corrupt officials throughout the territory, then she was holding the key to preventing Blackfeather's war. But she was also painting a target on herself that would never disappear. "Where is this ledger?" Blackfeather demanded. "Hidden where only I can find it. Kill me, and it stays hidden forever. But spare my brother, accept my public surrender, and I'll deliver it to you personally." Through the smoke and flames, Jack saw movement in the forest. Blackfeather's men repositioning themselves, getting ready to storm the cabin regardless of any deal their leader might make. The old bastard was playing for time, too, keeping Sarah talking while his killers prepared their final assault. But Sarah had seen them too. Her next words carried a subtle urgency that only Jack would recognize. "Of course, there is one small complication," she said conversationally. "The ledger isn't just hidden, it's protected. I've made arrangements for it to be delivered to the federal authorities in Helena if I don't check in with my contact every 72 hours. Blackfeather's voice turned sharp with suspicion. "What contact?" "Someone you know quite well, actually. Someone who's been investigating territorial corruption for the past year." Sarah smiled grimly. "U.S. Marshal Catherine Webb. She's been wondering why so many key witnesses in federal cases keep having fatal accidents." The name hit like a thunderclap. Everyone in the Montana Territory knew Marshal Webb by reputation, an incorruptible federal officer who'd built her career on taking down crooked politicians and their criminal networks. If she was already investigating territorial corruption, if Sarah really had made contact with her. "You're bluffing," Blackfeather snarled, but Jack could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Am I? Marshal Webb is camped 10 miles south of here with a federal posse. They're expecting me to check in at dawn. When I don't show up..." Sarah shrugged. "Well, let's just say your war might begin a little sooner than you planned. And with the wrong enemy." Jack realized what his sister was doing. She wasn't just buying time. She was forcing Blackfeather to choose between his careful long-term plan and the immediate satisfaction of revenge. If federal marshals were already in the area, if they were investigating territorial corruption, then any violence tonight would bring unwanted attention to Blackfeather's network. The smoke was getting thicker, the flames spreading across the cabin's roof. Soon, the decision would be made for all of them. In the distance, Jack heard something that made his heart leap. The sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Too many horses for Blackfeather's remaining men. Marshal Webb and her federal posse weren't 10 miles away after all. They were here,